new video on teaching grammar and writing in ESL and ESL. So to get us started, I want to ask you a question. This question is, how do ESL or language teachers typically teach grammar in the classroom? What have you seen? How have you learned? Did you answer with something like this? Grammar drill? So typically in the classroom, second language teachers will teach grammar by saying, okay, today we're going to start by learning the present perfect tense or the progressive tense or the simple past tense. That's focusing on a specific structure and everyone learns it at the same time, teaching it to the whole class. Students do some practice activity and generally that's followed up by a test, right? And of course the structure at that point is learned. Woohoo, we can check it off our list. Or is it learned? So here's the problem. This kind of approach, which is honestly based on a very long history of language learning, this kind of approach has been going on for about 300 or more years. So it's not surprising that it's pretty well grounded. But the problem with this approach is that there's a huge assumption behind it. And the assumption is a false one. This assumption is that language consists of a series of grammatical forms and structures, right, that can be learned and acquired successively. So you start off by learning the simple present tense, and then you move on to the simple past tense, and then you move on to the future tense, and then you move on to the progressive tenses. Well, it's not exactly the way that our brains work. 30 more years of research into second language acquisition proves what most of us have experienced in the classroom. And that is, presenting grammar rules doesn't create spontaneous and accurate production. So once you teach it, it doesn't mean that they're able to use it. And I've had this experience as a high school teacher before. When I first started teaching, I would get so frustrated in the fact that we would spend specific lessons on something like the simple past in preparation for writing a story. We'd study the simple past and look at the verbs, and then they'd go to write their story and they would conjugate their simple past tense verbs all wrong. So what's the issue? Well, we're going to look at what we're going to call a 21st century approach. So the communicative approaches. So in the 21st century, the one we're in now, the aim of language learning is acquiring communicative ability. So this kind of avoids the whole, not simply learning language through grammar rules and structures, but really focusing on being able to communicate a clear message to someone and being able to understand someone's message in return. And that means that we don't teach grammar explicitly in the way that we've been doing it. The opposite is true, of course. There's been extensive studies of French immersion programs that have just decided, hey, let's throw out the whole teaching grammar approach and we'll just focus on, speaking in the language. Well, that's not going to work either, because focusing on meaning with no attention to grammar forms, it's not enough. Okay, the students don't really acquire many aspects of the target language. So we can't just teach grammar explicitly. We can't throw grammar teaching out the window. What are we supposed to do? We do need to have some focus on form. So as teachers, right? So how are we supposed to get this done? How are we supposed to get them to learn the structures of the language? Well, this is where the PFEQ comes into play again. Yay, PFEQ! So the program calls for us to do something called focus on form. Focus on form. So it's a new way of thinking about grammar. Focus on form is effective for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it's focused on the learner. It's adapted to the learner's progression. It happens when the learner is attending to the meaning of their sentence or what they're trying to communicate and has a communication problem. So we're trying to express a story in the past tense and we're having a hard time doing it. You can see it's kind of like a problem-solving approach with the student. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the kind of problems or errors that they're making and then use that as the basis for our instruction. Just so you know, so here's the excerpt from the PFEQ. Just to back it up, it's chapter 5 of the secondary one, this one. Language conventions, intonation, pronunciation, focus on form, which is grammar, word order, agreement. So this is where the grammar comes in. So focus on form refers to communicative teaching that first draws the student's attention to the structure within the context of an interactive classroom. Well, that sounds all well and good, right? So how does this actually work in our ESL and ESL classroom? Well, this is where we're going to use the writing process. Woohoo! You're going to integrate teaching grammar as part of the writing process. So if you remember the writing process, we brainstorm, we organize our ideas, we write our draft, we revise and edit the draft, and then we, make a clean version and produce it. So throughout the next couple of slides, I'm going to be using an analogy. So your ability to communicate or write is kind of like a bicycle. It needs to get you from A to B. Your message needs to get from you to the person you're communicating with and back and forth. So grammar is super important part of this communicative process, but it really is only a part. So if you were going to teach grammar in isolation the way that we're doing, it's just like really focusing only on the gears and ignoring the wheels and the brakes and the bell, the light, the seat, all that other stuff, the frame that makes the bicycle go. So instead of teaching just the gears, just the grammar, we're going to focus on the whole process of the bicycle. Okay, so here's the first step. So yeah, the writing process, it's going to be part of the writing process. So what we're going to do, we're going to teach it in a series of steps. So the very first step, believe it or not, is not even to brainstorm. We're just going to write a bunch of texts. Then we're going to identify the structure, teach the structure, practice it, reinvest it, and evaluate as a diagnosis. I'm going to go through these one by one with you. Here we go. Step 1. Let's look, so what we do is we look at the writing the student is currently doing or the language the student is currently producing. Is the message clear? That's our focus. Is the bicycle getting us from A to B? Can we understand what the student is saying? So how do we do this? Well, we do a short diagnostic test. This is what usually happens at the beginning of the year when you ask students to write, what did you do on your summer vacation? That's nice to get to know them, but really importantly, it's also understanding what they are already capable of and where they need some focus. So the example on the left is a text my son wrote. You can see he has quite a few errors in here, but some of the message is clear. So we would take this and we would go through and have a look and say, okay, what can this student already do? And you can do this one-on-one, or you can do it as a whole class. So you can collect a whole bunch of writing samples from the students and look at the errors that they're making and say, okay, what does the class as a whole need to focus on? Okay, so we need to identify the problem. And you can do this through all kinds of free writing. And yes, I talked about it at the beginning of the year, but I would suggest doing it fairly frequently. Collect writing samples as much as possible. So, sorry. So some of the things you can ask them to do is, at the start of class or end of class, answer just keep free writing on things like when it rains, what do you like to do? What's your greatest fear? On the weekend, any of these are fine. The idea is really to get samples of the students' writing so that you can do that diagnostic. Okay, so once you have got all those writing samples, the next step is to really figure out what are the biggest mistakes that we need to focus on. They're probably making several, at least a dozen within the text. But we don't want to do all of them all at once. We want to work on one thing at a time. So let's have a look and see what errors can we focus on teaching that will really help them. So I'm using this example, and it's one that was provided by the ministry as a training. So it's called ice cream. You can tell that there's lots of great language in here. They've worked on it. So let's have a look just quickly and as an exercise. Say to yourself, read through it. What would you focus on? You can pause the video. So I'm going to provide you with a little tool that I call an error checklist. So the most important errors to focus on, kind of in this order, are first of all, errors that lead to a breakdown in communication. So you know that this is the whole point of being able to write in English or speak in English, is to communicate with someone, right? Communicate a message. So are there any errors here that really stop us from understanding what the student is trying to say? Next, are there any errors that have been the focus of instruction? Is there something that you've really been working on with the class? Um, if they're not getting that, then that's what you have to go back and focus on and reteach. Then are there any errors that have been selected by the teacher or learner themselves? And this kind of gets into the individualized approach to a writing portfolio. As I got into this approach, I would often ask students to write a sample and then tell me at the top of the page, what is it that they're focusing on? Is it focusing on using capitals? Is it focusing on using correct punctuation? For some of the more advanced students, it would be, I'm going to use personification, or I'm going to include some interactive dialogue or descriptive imagery. It doesn't really matter. So if the learner themselves or the teacher can really help focus their writing at the time. And you put it at the top of the page, you've got individualized instruction right there. That aside, anything that occurs frequently in the learner's output. So if there are mistakes that they're making a lot, you're going to maximize the return on investment here if you really focus on those. You fix that one mistake they're making all the time, you're going to clear up most of their mistakes. And finally, this is a big one, errors that are stigmatized. A lot of the time, second language learners don't realize that some words are just not appropriate. They hear them a lot in the media, and so they think that they can replicate those when they speak to you. So we need to teach them about context and register. So, you know, what language to use when you're writing a CV, and what language to use when you're writing an email, and what language is okay when you're texting a buddy. Right. So let's have a look at this again. What errors did you spot? Did you see any that led to a communication breakdown? I can see one. Are there any that are stigmatized? How about ones that occur frequently? At this point, make a list of a couple of the errors you'd like to focus on based on those criteria. You don't know what the students' goals were, and you don't know what the focus of instruction was, so you can't really focus on that, but those three can help you out. All right, so if you're in a classroom with the students, you've got your list. Now you're going to teach the grammar point based on the list. And here's the great part. It's going to be a lot more meaningful to these students because the grammar is going to be more meaningful because you're going to show them, hey guys, we're going to focus on this today because I see that a lot of you are making these mistakes. And this is how we actually do it. This is how we write it correctly. And we're just going to focus on this one together, and I want you to learn it, go back and correct the mistakes that you made in your writing. So you can draw the students' attention to the structure, do some inductive reasoning with them, teach them the grammar point, what's the problem, and it really helps them understand why it's important to make that correction. It's not just for the grade, but it'll actually improve your writing. Right, so you're going to model how to use the structure. You can compare incorrect and correct structures. This is where you can do your drill, right? Practice with controlled writing, fill in the blank, different examples, and then ask them to explain the rule to a friend. Have them write practice sentences just with a targeted structure, and then go back and correct their mistakes. And then you write a new one. That's the next step. So step 4 is to reinvest and write something new. So remember I talked about getting the students to write on their grammar focus. So they're going to write a new piece of writing now that really focuses on that structure that you were working on. So let's say I was focusing on a typical one is a homonym, the difference between there, and there. So I've focused on that with the students. We've understood where that's an issue. We've identified it. We've practiced it. And now we're going to write a new piece of writing that their grammar focus is on the homonyms there, and there. Strategy I'll use is I'll, refer to my resources on the side of my page, or I'll highlight and circle every time it occurs in the text. So they're going to write their text, and when I go and correct it, I am specifically looking at just that. There, and there. Did they do that correctly? Did they manage to use those homonyms correctly? And then after that, that's my evaluation. After that, I go and see for a new diagnostic. What other mistakes are we making? Now that they've achieved that, what else can we fix? The other idea to keep in mind is that if you are focusing on a specific structure, so for example, if you're focusing on teaching them capital letters, you might want to consider what writing tasks would really help them to write with capital letters. So for example, going on a world tour. Not possible right now, but there you go. Because you have lots of capitals for city names and country names, or the time you met a celebrity in a restaurant, the name of the restaurant, the name of the celebrity. So yeah, think about the kind of writing activity and make sure that it will really help them focus on that structure that you're working on. Okay. And as I mentioned, the last step was to evaluate the initial problem. So give them the grade on how well did they manage to fix their problem? Did they understand it? Did they understand the difference between there, and there? That's their mark. And use that writing sample for a new diagnostic. So just again, these are the steps. The first one is to collect the writing samples, do a diagnostic, focus on the teaching structure, write a new sample, evaluate that, and do a new diagnostic, and then focus on the new structure and rinse and repeat. You can see this becomes a cycle where the students, as they write more and more and fix each structure one by one, their writing will gradually improve over time. So that's the idea. Writing is a process of writing and improving together. That's it. Thank you for watching.